The city was alive with noise, but for one young woman the sounds of traffic, voices, and neon signs felt distant. Her name was Amara. She walked slowly along the cracked pavement, her worn shoes pressing against the ground with a weight heavier than her small body should have carried. On her back was an old backpack, one that sagged with papers, half-finished job applications, and envelopes she could not bring herself to open because she already knew what they said. Bills, demands, warnings. Amara had learned long ago how to live with little. She grew up in a neighborhood where neighbors shared food when they had it and went hungry when they did not. Her mother, who had worked endless shifts as a housekeeper, often reminded her that dignity was something no one could take from you. Even if you had nothing left in your pocket, you could still hold your head high and live with kindness. Those words were the only wealth Amara carried with her now. It was late evening when she pushed open the door of a small diner at the corner of the street. The bell above the door jingled, but no one looked up. People were busy with their own meals, their own lives. The warmth inside the diner wrapped around her, but her stomach growled louder than any welcome. She had not eaten since morning, and even then it had been nothing more than a dry piece of bread. Amara moved quietly to a booth by the window, sitting down with her shoulders slightly hunched. She glanced at the menu, her eyes scanning the numbers on the side more than the dishes. Every price felt like a mountain. She opened her wallet carefully, her fingers pulling out a few crumpled bills and coins. It was barely enough for a single plate of food, but tonight, she decided, she would not deny herself. Hunger had gnawed at her for too long. The waitress came by, her face tired but polite. Amara ordered the cheapest meal she could find, a bowl of hot stew with bread. The waitress nodded and walked away. Amara leaned back, letting out a slow breath as if even the act of deciding to spend that money had been heavy. She reminded herself that tomorrow she would figure out another way, another plan. She always did. Life had not given her much choice. Around her, the diner was filled with little moments of life. A group of teenagers laughed loudly near the jukebox. A man in a business suit typed furiously on his laptop between bites of his burger. A mother fed her toddler in the corner booth, wiping his face with a napkin while he giggled. To anyone else, these were ordinary scenes, but to Amara, they felt like glimpses of another world, a world where people had more than enough. Her eyes wandered, and that was when she noticed them. An elderly couple sat at a table not far from hers. The man's hair was thin and white, his back slightly bent. The woman beside him had a gentle face but tired eyes. They looked fragile, as if the weight of years pressed down on their shoulders. The man was trying to cut a piece of food for his wife, but his hands trembled, the knife slipping more than once. The woman reached out, her own hands shaking as she tried to steady his. For a moment they exchanged a small smile, but Amara saw the strain beneath it. The waitress passed their table, but her expression held little patience. She set down a plate carelessly, barely glancing at them before hurrying away. Amara's heart tightened. She could see the old couple struggling, not just with their food, but with the quiet loneliness that surrounded them. No one else seemed to notice. Everyone kept eating, kept talking, as if kindness was too expensive to offer. Amara lowered her eyes, staring at her empty table. Soon her meal would come, and she would finally have something warm to eat. Her stomach growled again, sharp and insistent. But her mind kept drifting back to the couple. She remembered her own grandmother, who used to sit on the porch, her hands frail but her spirit strong. Amara remembered feeding her soup on days when she was too weak to hold a spoon. The memory pierced her heart. Her food arrived, a bowl of stew, steaming and fragrant, with a piece of bread on the side. The waitress placed it down and left without a word. Amara inhaled the smell, her hunger urging her to pick up the spoon immediately, but her hands did not move. Instead, she glanced back at the old couple. The woman had given up on trying to eat, her spoon resting on the table. The man stared down at his plate, his expression filled with quiet defeat. Amara sat frozen. Inside her, a battle began. She was starving. This was the only proper meal she would have in days. Yet something stronger than hunger pulled at her. A voice deep within reminded her of her mother's words. Dignity, kindness, humanity. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she lifted the bowl of stew from her table. Her legs carried her forward before her mind could protest. The couple looked up in surprise as Amara approached. She set the bowl gently in front of them, her voice soft but steady. "Please," she said, "let me help you. This is for you." The woman's eyes widened, her mouth opening as if to refuse. "No, dear. You must keep it. You need it. Amara shook her head with a small smile. I will be fine. But you need it more than I do. The diner grew quieter. People turned their heads watching the exchange. Amara ignored them. She placed the bread on the table, pushing it gently toward the couple. The old man's eyes glistened with tears as he whispered, "Why would you do this?" Amara's smile trembled, but she kept it. "Because you remind me of someone I loved. And because kindness is all I have to give." The woman's hands shook as she pulled the bowl closer. Slowly, carefully, she took a spoonful, her eyes never leaving Amara's face. Gratitude and disbelief mingled in her expression. The man reached for Amara's hand, squeezing it weakly as if trying to pass on years of unspoken thanks. Amara nodded and stepped back, her heart pounding. She returned to her booth, now empty, her stomach still aching with hunger. But somehow her chest felt lighter. She had given away the only thing she had, and yet in that moment she did not feel poor. She felt human. The rest of the diner returned to its noise and chatter, but Amara sat quietly, staring out the window at the dark street. She had no idea that this simple act, born out of compassion, would ripple far beyond the walls of this diner. She had no idea that someone else was watching, someone whose life was far removed from hers, someone who would soon change her world forever. The night outside the diner had grown colder, and the streetlights painted long shadows across the pavement, but inside the warmth remained. Amara sat quietly in her booth, her stomach still empty, though her soul felt strangely full. She tried to steady her thoughts, reminding herself that tomorrow she would face another battle, another shift, another long walk, another day of trying to stretch the little she had. But her eyes could not stop drifting back toward the elderly couple. She had expected them to eat quickly, embarrassed by the attention of strangers, yet something about the way they handled the meal caught her heart in a deeper way. The old woman leaned slightly toward her husband, feeding him small spoonfuls, whispering something only he could hear. His tired eyes softened as he looked at her, and for a moment Amara saw not weakness, but a love that had carried them across decades. It made her think of her parents, who had struggled for years together until illness tore them apart. The couple seemed to notice her watching, and instead of shame, they offered her a faint smile. It was the kind of smile that carried gratitude too deep for words. Amara lowered her gaze quickly, feeling a strange heat in her chest. She had only done what felt right, yet something about their silent thanks reached into places of her soul she had buried. The waitress passed by again, this time glancing between Amara and the old couple. There was something different in her face now, not annoyance but curiosity. For a brief second her eyes softened as if even she had been touched by what happened. Amara leaned her head against the glass of the window, staring at the blurred reflections of neon lights outside. In the reflection she could see herself, the girl with tired eyes, a sweater too thin for winter, and a backpack that carried burdens no one else could see. She thought of her choices, of how others might call them foolish. Who gives away their only meal when they have nothing? But in her heart she knew she could not have done anything else. Hunger would pass. Regret would not. The couple began to rise slowly after finishing the stew, their movements stiff and fragile. The old man held onto the edge of the table for balance, while the woman placed a steadying hand on his arm. Amara watched as they shuffled toward the door, their heads turning once more in her direction. The old woman raised her hand slightly, not in a wave but in a gesture of deep acknowledgement, as if saying, "You have not just fed us, you have reminded us that kindness still exists." Amara pressed her lips into a small smile and nodded back. As the door closed behind them, and the night air rushed in briefly, the diner returned to its usual rhythm. People resumed their conversations. Laughter rose again and plates clattered in the kitchen. Yet for Amara the moment lingered like a soft echo. She could not explain why, but it felt as though the couple had left a piece of themselves with her. Her body reminded her of its own needs as her stomach groaned again, but she pushed the thought aside. Hunger had always been there, but it would not break her. She reached for her backpack and began pulling out the small notebook she carried everywhere. The pages were filled with notes from job applications, motivational quotes she had written down, and lists of goals she refused to let go of. On one page, in her careful handwriting, were the words, "Do good, even when no one sees." She traced the line with her finger, unaware that tonight someone had indeed seen. In a quiet corner of the diner, a man sat alone at a booth. He had entered unnoticed earlier, wearing an old coat and simple clothes that made him blend in with the rest of the diners. His hair was streaked with gray, his face calm, and his posture unassuming. No one would have guessed that behind the ordinary appearance was a billionaire whose name often appeared in newspapers, though rarely with his picture. He preferred to keep his presence hidden, to move through the world without fanfare. He had built empires and businesses, but he had also grown tired of the empty flattery and false smiles wealth always attracted. What he had just witnessed shook something deep inside him. From his booth he had seen every detail of the exchange. The way the young woman gave away her meal without hesitation, the trembling hands of the old couple, the quiet strength in her eyes as she returned to her empty table. It was not a show for attention, not an act done for reward. It was pure, genuine, the kind of kindness money could never buy, and it unsettled him, because it reminded him of a time long ago when he had been the one with nothing. His own mother had once gone hungry so that he could eat. He remembered her pushing her plate toward him when he was a boy, telling him she was not hungry when in truth she was starving. That memory had fueled his ambition, driving him to ensure he would never feel that helpless again. But over the years, surrounded by wealth and power, he had nearly forgotten the rawness of those days. Tonight in a small diner, a stranger had brought it all rushing back. He sat silently, his mind turning over possibilities. He could leave without saying a word, let the moment fade into just another story of human decency. Or he could step into her world even briefly and acknowledge her sacrifice. He studied her face from across the room, the way her eyes held both exhaustion and defiance, the way her shoulders carried invisible weight. He knew instantly that she was not someone looking for pity. She was someone who, despite her own hunger, had chosen to give, and that choice told him everything about her character. Amara packed away her notebook and prepared to leave, unaware that eyes were following her every move. She rose from her seat, adjusting her backpack on her shoulders. The waitress gave her a strange look, almost as if she wanted to say something but stopped herself. Amara offered her a faint smile and nodded politely before stepping toward the door. The bell above jingled again as she pushed it open, letting the cold air wash over her. She pulled her sweater tighter around her body and disappeared into the night. The man in the booth remained seated, his hands clasped together as he thought deeply. The diner was buzzing around him, but his focus never wavered from the memory of what he had just seen. Something inside him stirred, a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. He knew he could not let this night pass without acting. Amara walked down the street, her breath visible in the frosty air. Her mind replayed the image of the old couple's grateful faces, and for the first time in days she felt a strange peace despite the emptiness in her stomach. She did not know that only a few steps behind her, fate had already begun to weave a thread that would soon pull her life into a story she could never have imagined. And as the man finally stood, paid his bill quietly, and followed her path into the night, the first steps of an extraordinary encounter had already been set into motion. The night air bit sharply against Amara's skin as she walked away from the diner, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional passing car and the flicker of neon signs from small shops still open. Her stomach ached from hunger, a hollow pain that had become so familiar it was almost like an old companion. Yet despite the gnawing emptiness, there was a quiet strength in her steps. She had given away her only meal, and though her body longed for food, her heart felt strangely alive. She thought of the old couple's faces, their eyes filled with gratitude, and it soothed her more than any stew could have. Her neighborhood was only a few blocks away, filled with aging buildings where walls were thin and neighbors carried the sounds of each other's lives whether they wanted to or not. Amara climbed the narrow staircase to her small apartment, unlocking the door that creaked with the sound of years. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single bulb and the air was heavy with silence. She placed her backpack down and sank onto the small couch that doubled as her bed. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the half-filled notebook lying on the table. She opened it to a page where she had scribbled in uneven letters, "When you have nothing else, give kindness." She read the words over and over, her eyes heavy with fatigue until sleep pulled her into its arms. Morning came with a pale light seeping through the curtains. Amara woke to the sound of footsteps and voices in the hallway outside her apartment. She rubbed her eyes, forcing herself to sit up. Her body was weak, her stomach still aching, but she pushed the discomfort aside. There was no time for self-pity. She had work to do, bills to worry about, and a world that rarely waited for anyone who lagged behind. She gathered her things and stepped out, her mind already preparing for another day of struggle. Unbeknownst to her, the man who had watched her in the diner the night before had spent the entire night thinking about what he had seen. He had returned to his large home, a place filled with luxury that often felt hollow. He had walked through halls lined with art, through rooms filled with fine furniture, yet none of it gave him peace. The image of the young woman offering her meal to strangers replayed in his mind endlessly. It unsettled him in ways he could not fully explain. For years he had surrounded himself with wealth, with people who sought him out for what he could give them, never for who he was. But this young woman, who had nothing, had given everything in that moment without hesitation. That kind of sacrifice was rare. It was priceless, and he knew he could not ignore it. As Amara walked to her first job, she thought only of survival. She stopped briefly at a corner store to buy a cheap cup of coffee with the last of her coins. The bitter taste did little to fill her, but it gave her warmth as she continued on. Her job at a cleaning service was grueling, scrubbing floors and polishing surfaces until her hands were raw, but she did it without complaint. Every dollar mattered. She dreamed of one day returning to school, of finding a career that would allow her to stand tall. But those dreams often felt like stars, visible, beautiful, but far out of reach. When the shift ended, she stepped outside, her body aching. She adjusted her backpack, ready to head toward her second job at a small bookstore across town. It was during this walk that something unusual happened. As she moved through the crowd, a car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down slowly, and the man from the diner leaned out slightly, his eyes calm but filled with intent. "Excuse me," he said softly. Amara paused, startled. She recognized him faintly from the diner but did not understand why he was here, why he was speaking to her. She tightened her grip on her backpack and took a cautious step back. "I was at the diner last night," the man continued. His voice carried no arrogance, only sincerity. "I saw what you did. You gave away your meal." Heat rushed to Amara's cheeks and she looked away, embarrassed. She had not done it to be noticed, and the thought of a stranger bringing it up unsettled her. "It was nothing," she whispered. The man shook his head. "It was not nothing. It was everything. You gave away the only thing you had. Most people in this world would not do that." Amara shrugged slightly, still uncomfortable. "They needed it more than I did. That is all." The man studied her face for a moment, seeing the quiet strength in her eyes. He knew there was no false modesty here, no hidden agenda. She had meant every word. He nodded slowly. "You may not know it, but that act of kindness has more power than you realize." Amara's brow furrowed as she glanced at him. She did not understand what he meant, nor why a stranger would care so much. She shifted on her feet, unsure whether to continue the conversation or walk away. The man seemed to sense her unease. He gave a small smile. "Forgive me. My name is Daniel." He extended his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Amara shook it politely. His grip was firm but gentle. "Amara," she replied quietly. Daniel repeated her name softly, as if committing it to memory. "Amara, that is a strong name." There was a pause between them, the sounds of the city filling the silence. Amara adjusted her backpack again, ready to leave, but Daniel spoke once more. "May I see you again? I would like to talk to you. About opportunities, about life." Amara blinked, her suspicion rising. She had heard words like that before, from people who promised much but delivered little. Her world had taught her to be cautious, to guard herself against disappointment. "Why?" she asked simply. Daniel held her gaze steadily. "Because I believe kindness like yours deserves to be seen." "Deserves to be rewarded?" Amara's throat tightened. She did not know what to say, and part of her wanted to end the conversation quickly. Yet something in his eyes, an honesty she could not ignore, made her pause. For reasons she could not explain, she nodded faintly. "Maybe," she whispered, before turning and continuing on her path. Daniel watched her go, his heart stirred in ways he had not felt in years. He knew he had to earn her trust slowly, carefully. He knew this was only the beginning. That night, as Amara sat alone in her apartment again, she thought about the encounter. She wondered who Daniel truly was and why he cared about a poor woman like her. She wondered if his words meant anything or if they were just empty promises. She had learned not to expect miracles. Life had never handed her blessings freely. But deep inside, a tiny spark of curiosity flickered. Maybe, just maybe, her sacrifice had set something in motion that she could not yet see. And as she closed her eyes to sleep, Daniel sat in his grand home across the city, already planning how he would return to her life, how he would knock on her door and show her that sometimes, when kindness is given freely, the universe finds a way to bring it back tenfold. The following morning began much like any other for Amara, with the sound of pipes rattling in the walls and the faint cries of a baby from the apartment next door. Her small room was filled with the gray light of dawn, casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. She stretched her aching arms, her stomach groaning at the absence of food, but her heart remained quiet. She had grown used to the emptiness both in her belly and in her life. Survival was a routine, and each day was a new battle against the weight of poverty. Yet something inside her felt different now, a subtle shift that she could not quite explain. Perhaps it was the memory of the old couple, their grateful eyes as they ate the meal she had given. Perhaps it was the strange man who had stopped her on the street and spoken with a voice full of respect instead of pity. Amara dressed in her usual clothes, a faded hoodie and worn-out jeans, and set out for work. The streets were alive with people rushing toward their own destinations, but she walked at a steady pace, her mind drifting back to the diner. She could still see the way the old man's trembling hand had rested on hers, the way the old woman had lifted her spoon with tears in her eyes. That image had rooted itself deeply in her memory, as if life had given her a reason to believe that kindness was never wasted. She did not expect recognition or reward, but the gratitude she had witnessed was enough to remind her that even small sacrifices could carry great meaning. At the diner itself, the waitress from the night before remembered her. She looked up when Amara passed by the window, her expression softer than before. For a moment their eyes met, and though no words were exchanged, something unspoken passed between them. The waitress gave a faint nod, acknowledging what Amara had done. It was not applause, not praise, but it was respect, and for Amara that was enough. She continued walking, her lips pressed into a thin smile. Later that day, Amara took a break during her shift at the bookstore. She sat on a stool near the counter, flipping through a second-hand book that had been donated. It was a collection of short stories, tales of people who had endured hardships but found unexpected hope. As she read, she felt an odd kinship with the characters on the pages. Their struggles mirrored her own, and their small victories gave her strength. Customers came and went, some offering polite smiles, most passing by without notice. Amara did her work quietly, helping where she could, shelving books and offering directions. She was used to blending into the background, her presence often overlooked, but she never allowed bitterness to take root. Instead, she held on to the belief that even unnoticed acts of goodness could make the world softer. That evening, when her shift ended, she walked home under the fading glow of streetlights. The city around her buzzed with life, but she felt a calmness within, as though her sacrifice at the diner had settled something inside her. She did not have food waiting at home, and her body ached with fatigue, yet her mind returned again and again to the couple's silent gratitude. Their eyes had spoken more than words ever could. She remembered the way the old man had tried to thank her, his voice trembling as he asked why she would give away her food. She remembered her own response, spoken without thought. "Because kindness is all I have to give." Those words now echoed in her heart, and she realized they were true. Her pockets were empty, but her soul was not. Meanwhile, Daniel, the man who had watched her at the diner, could not erase the memory of her gesture. In his world of business and wealth, he had seen people trade favors and smiles for profit, but what Amara had done was different. It was raw, unpolished, and uncalculated. It had been a sacrifice, one that no one had asked her to make, one that no one had rewarded. He had returned to his office that day, surrounded by towering glass walls and the hum of executives discussing numbers, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed the moment in his head, the way she had pushed her bowl across the table, the way she had spoken softly to the couple, the way she had walked away without seeking acknowledgement. He wondered how many people in his own circles would have done the same. Few, he thought. Perhaps none. Daniel began asking quiet questions about the neighborhood near the diner, about the people who lived there. He did not reveal his reasons. but he was determined to find out more about the young woman whose act of kindness had unsettled his heart. His assistants noticed his unusual distraction, but they knew better than to pry. Daniel had always been private, but this was something new. It was as if the billionaire, who seemed untouchable to many, had been reminded that humanity was still fragile and beautiful. Days passed, and Amara continued her routine, unaware of the watchful eyes that followed her path. She rose early, worked tirelessly, and came home to her small apartment with weary steps. Yet she carried with her a strange sense of fulfillment that hunger could not erase. The old couple's faces still lived in her memory, etched deeply into her thoughts. She often wondered where they were, if they remembered her, if their lives had been made a little brighter by her sacrifice. One evening, as she sat at her small table with only a cup of tea to quiet her stomach, she heard a knock at the door. It startled her, as visitors were rare in her life. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her mind racing with possibilities. Slowly she opened it, and to her surprise there stood the elderly couple from the diner. Their faces lit up when they saw her, and they held a small paper bag in their hands. "We wanted to thank you properly," the old woman said, her voice trembling but warm. She handed Amara the bag, and inside was a simple meal, bread, fruit, and soup. Amara's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head, not wanting to take what they had, but the old man gently insisted. "You gave to us when you had nothing. Please let us give something back." Amara accepted the bag with shaking hands, her voice caught in her throat. She invited them inside. And for the first time in a long while, her small apartment was filled with laughter and gentle conversation. They ate together at her tiny table, sharing stories of the past and dreams of the future. For a few precious hours, the walls of her home no longer felt heavy with loneliness. When they left, Amara sat in silence, her heart brimming. Gratitude had circled back to her in a way she never expected. It was not wealth, it was not luxury, but it was proof that kindness had a way of multiplying. She did not know that this was only the beginning, that even greater changes were on the horizon. For now, she simply held on to the memory of their smiles, the warmth of their voices, and the quiet truth that the world had not forgotten her sacrifice. Across the city, Daniel prepared to take the next step. He had seen enough, learned enough, and now he was certain. The young woman named Amara had something the world needed, something money could never buy. He knew the time had come to bridge the distance between their worlds, to show her that her kindness had not gone unnoticed. Soon he would knock on her door, and her life would never be the same. The city was alive that week with its usual rhythm of rushing cars, crowded sidewalks, and the endless hum of lives overlapping. But for Amara, the days blurred together into a routine that demanded all her strength. She rose early, walked to her jobs, worked until her hands ached, and returned home to her quiet apartment. Hunger was still a regular visitor, but it no longer frightened her the way it once did. She had grown used to living with little. What gave her strength now was not the food she lacked, but the memory of the old couple's gratitude and the kindness that had circled back when they brought her a meal. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of connection to the world, a reminder that her life, no matter how small it seemed, could touch others. Unseen by her, another presence followed quietly, not with menace but with intent. Daniel, the man who had watched her in the diner, had made a decision. He had lived long enough in a world where wealth attracted false smiles and empty words, where people bowed to his success, but rarely to his humanity. He had hidden behind the armor of business suits, numbers, and titles. But Amara's simple act had cut through all of that. It had reached him in a place untouched by contracts or profits, a place where he was still the boy who remembered his mother's sacrifice. And so he watched, not to intrude but to understand. He learned her routine without ever disturbing it. He saw her leave for her cleaning job before the sun had fully risen, her figure small against the wide streets. He saw her return late at night with tired steps, carrying second-hand books from the store as if they were treasures. He saw the way she smiled faintly at neighbors, even when they barely noticed her presence. He even saw her pause to help a stray dog one evening, breaking off the last piece of bread she had to feed it. Every moment confirmed what he already knew, that her kindness was not a performance, not an isolated act in a diner, but the very fabric of who she was. Daniel found himself humbled. He had built a fortune large enough to change entire communities, yet he had forgotten what it meant to change one life. He had spoken at conferences about leadership and responsibility, But when he saw Amara, he realized she embodied more leadership in her small acts than he had in all his speeches. She gave when she had nothing. She stood tall though the world pressed down on her. And though she never sought attention, she glowed with a dignity that wealth could not manufacture. Amara, meanwhile, remained unaware of the hidden witness to her life. She continued on believing herself invisible, just another face in the crowd. At times she wondered if her sacrifices mattered, if giving away her meal had been foolish. Yet every time doubt crept in, she remembered the look in the old couple's eyes, the way they had held her hand as if it carried more weight than gold. That memory was enough to quiet the voice of despair. One evening, Amara sat in her apartment with her notebook open. She wrote by the dim light of a lamp, filling pages with her thoughts. She wrote about the meaning of sacrifice, about how the smallest act could ripple outward. She wrote about her dreams of a life where she could give more, not just scraps of food or a kind smile, but real opportunities for others. She did not know if those dreams would ever come true, but writing them down gave her courage. As her pen scratched across the page, she whispered to herself, "Kindness never leaves empty hands." She believed it, even if the proof had yet to appear. Across the city, Daniel sat in his study, the quiet ticking of a clock filling the silence. On his desk were papers, contracts, and deals worth millions, yet his eyes were fixed on a single sheet in front of him. It was not a business proposal, but a letter he had begun to write. It was addressed simply, to the young woman at the diner. He had rewritten it several times, each attempt falling short. How could he explain that her small act had reminded him of truths he had nearly forgotten? How could he show her that her sacrifice mattered, not just to the couple she had fed, but to him as well? For the first time in years, words felt heavy on his tongue. He set the pen down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He realized that perhaps words alone would not be enough. People in Amara's world had likely heard countless promises, and most had been broken. He did not want to be another empty voice. He wanted to act, to prove through deeds what words could never capture, and so he made a decision. He would no longer remain a hidden witness. He would step into her life, not to overwhelm her with wealth, but to honor her humanity. The following day, Amara walked home from the bookstore as the sky darkened with clouds. She clutched her backpack close, feeling the chill of the air seep through her thin jacket. She thought about stopping at the diner again, but the thought of spending money she did not have held her back. She sighed, resigned to another night of tea and a piece of fruit. As she turned the corner to her building, she noticed a car parked nearby. It was sleek, too polished for her neighborhood, and it made her hesitate. Daniel sat inside, watching as she approached. His heart pounded with a nervousness he had not felt in decades. For all his power in boardrooms, for all his confidence in negotiating billion-dollar deals, he felt strangely uncertain now. Approaching Amara was not business. It was human. And human moments always carried risk. Amara walked past the car, her eyes downcast, but Daniel stepped out. His voice was calm, almost hesitant as he called to her. "Amara," she froze, turning slowly. Recognition flickered in her eyes as she saw him. The man from the diner, the man who had stopped her on the street. "You again," she murmured, her tone wary but not unkind. Daniel nodded. "Yes, me again. I did not want to frighten you. I only wanted to tell you something I did not say before." Amara shifted on her feet, clutching her backpack like a shield. "What is it?" Daniel took a breath. "That night in the diner when you gave away your meal, I watched everything. I saw the way you sacrificed, the way you gave without asking for anything. It reminded me of my own past, of my mother. And I want you to know, it changed me." Amara blinked, confusion and suspicion mingling in her eyes. "Changed you? I do not understand." Daniel's gaze held hers firmly. "Most people believe only money has power, but I have seen fortunes crumble, businesses fail. What you did, that has more power than anything I have ever built. It showed me that kindness still exists in a world that often forgets it. I cannot ignore that." Silence stretched between them, heavy but charged. Amara searched his face, looking for the hint of pity she despised, but found none. There was only sincerity, only a man who seemed almost humbled by her. Finally, she shook her head. "I did not do it to be seen. I did it because it was right." Daniel smiled faintly. "And that is exactly why it matters." For the first time, Amara felt her guard slip just a little. She nodded slowly, uncertain of what this meant but unable to deny the warmth in his words. As Daniel stood there, the hidden witness revealed, she had no idea that his next step would change her life forever. The morning broke quietly in Amara's small apartment. The pale sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, painting faint lines across the cracked walls. She lay awake before her alarm could ring, staring at the ceiling, her mind too restless to return to sleep. The memory of the previous night pressed heavily against her chest. She had spoken once more to the man named Daniel, who had confessed that her single act of kindness had reached into his life and shaken something within him. She could still hear his words echoing in her head, and that is exactly why it matters. It puzzled her, confused her, even unsettled her. Why would a stranger care so much about what she had done? Why would he follow her, wait for her, and speak with such conviction about something that had cost her dearly? Amara rose and made herself a cup of tea, sipping it slowly as she sat at her small table. Her notebook lay open, and she stared at the blank page for a long time before writing a single line. I gave because I had to. He saw because he was meant to. She tapped the pen against the paper, her thoughts drifting. She was not used to being noticed. Her life was one of quiet endurance, of moving through the world without leaving much of a mark. Yet suddenly someone had seen her, not with pity but with a strange respect that she did not quite know how to accept. She shook off the thoughts and prepared for her day. Life did not pause for questions or reflections. There were jobs to work, bills to worry about, and hunger that always lurked close by. She dressed, pulled on her worn shoes, and stepped into the hallway. As she locked the door behind her, she could not help but wonder if she would see Daniel again. Part of her hoped not. Life had taught her that expectations only led to disappointment. But another part of her, quiet and fragile, wondered what it would mean if she did. Across the city, Daniel sat in his office, but the papers in front of him blurred before his eyes. He had not been able to think of business since that night outside Amara's apartment. For years he had devoted himself to building an empire, to ensuring security and power. Yet none of it had stirred his soul the way her sacrifice had. It had been days now, and still the image of her pushing her meal toward the old couple replayed in his mind like a lesson he could not afford to forget. He knew he could not remain on the edges of her life any longer. He had been a witness long enough. It was time to act, to step forward, to bring into her world something she could never expect. That evening, Amara returned home after another exhausting day. She climbed the staircase slowly, her legs heavy from hours of work. Her apartment door waited at the end of the hall, the chipped paint familiar, the brass doorknob cold beneath her fingers. She pushed it open and entered the stillness she knew too well. She dropped her backpack onto the couch and sank into the chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The silence wrapped around her like an old coat. She had grown used to it, but some nights it felt heavier than others. As she sat there letting the quiet settle, a sound broke through the stillness, a knock on the door. Her eyes opened sharply. It was rare for anyone to visit her. She rose slowly, her heart pounding. Each step toward the door seemed louder than the last. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob, her mind racing with questions. Who could it be? A neighbor?
The landlord?
Or perhaps, though she dared not believe it, Daniel. She turned the knob and opened the door. There he was. Daniel stood in the dim hallway light, his posture straight, his face calm but filled with something she had not seen before. Not arrogance, not pity, but determination. He held nothing in his hands, no grand gestures, no offerings, just his presence. Good evening, Amara, he said softly. Her breath caught, surprise flickering across her face. What are you doing here? I needed to see you, Daniel replied. His voice was steady, carrying a weight that made it impossible to doubt his sincerity. I told you before that what you did changed me. I cannot just walk away from that. I had to come here to your door and say it to you properly. Amara gripped the edge of the door, uncertain. 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave, to remind him that she did not need his attention or his words. Another part of her, deeper and quieter, wanted to let him in, to hear what he had to say. Why? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel met her gaze. Because I believe kindness like yours deserves more than silence. You gave away your meal, and in that moment you showed me something I had forgotten. I want to help you, Amara. I want to give back what you gave, and more. Her eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion rising. Help me, you do not even know me. I know enough, Daniel said gently. I know you gave when you had nothing. I know you live with dignity even when life has been cruel. I know that most people in your place would have kept the meal, but you gave it away. That tells me more about who you are than anything else could. Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to push him away, but his words pierced through the armor she had built around herself. Still, she shook her head. I do not want charity. Daniel stepped closer, his tone firm but kind. This is not charity. This is recognition. This is me telling you that the world needs people like you. And if I have the means to make your life lighter, I will do it. Not because I pity you, but because I respect you. Silence filled the hallway. Amara stood frozen, her heart racing. She studied his face, searching for insincerity, but found none. She could not deny the truth in his eyes. The way he looked at her, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who had taught him something valuable. Finally, her grip on the door loosened. She stepped aside slowly, allowing him to enter. Daniel walked into her small apartment, his eyes moving across the worn furniture, the peeling walls, the quiet signs of a life lived in struggle. He did not judge. Instead, he sat down in the chair opposite hers, leaning forward slightly. I know this is unusual, he admitted, and I know you have every reason to doubt me, but I promise you, Amara, I am here because I believe your kindness should not go unnoticed. I want to offer you opportunities, education, stability, a chance to build the life you deserve. Amara stared at him, her mind spinning. It was too much, too sudden. She had lived so long expecting nothing that the thought of someone offering her everything felt impossible. She shook her head again, tears stinging her eyes. Why me? She whispered. Daniel smiled faintly, his voice soft. Because you reminded me of my mother. She once sacrificed her meals so I could eat. She gave when she had nothing, just like you. And because of her, I became who I am today. You are that reminder, Amara. You are proof that kindness still lives in this world. And I cannot turn away from that. The tears spilled down her cheeks, now silent and unbidden. She covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. For so long she had carried her struggles alone, believing herself invisible. But here was a man standing in her home, telling her that her life mattered, that her choices mattered, that her sacrifice had meaning beyond what she could see. When she finally lowered her hands, Daniel was still watching her, his eyes steady, his presence calm. She took a shaky breath and whispered, I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything tonight, Daniel replied gently. Just know that this is only the beginning. I will not disappear. I will prove to you that I mean what I say. And one day soon, Amara, you will see that your kindness has changed not just one life, but many. The night stretched on, but for Amara, time felt suspended. She had opened her door to a stranger and found instead a turning point she could never have predicted. She did not know what the future held, but as she sat across from Daniel, she realized that her world had already begun to shift. The night Daniel first sat across from Amara in her small apartment lingered in her memory like a dream that refused to fade. His words echoed long after he had gone. Your kindness has more power than anything I have ever built. She replayed them in her mind as she lay awake on her couch that evening, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how a billionaire could find meaning in something she had thought of as so small. For years she had given what little she had, never expecting it to return, and suddenly it felt as if life had noticed her, as if the universe itself had whispered back. In the days that followed, Amara tried to return to her routine. She woke early, dressed in her worn clothes, and went to her jobs. She scrubbed floors until her hands burned, shelved books until her back ached, and came home to her empty apartment each night. Yet nothing felt the same. The silence no longer pressed as heavily on her, because she knew that someone had seen her sacrifice and chosen to step into her world. Still, she remained cautious. Life had taught her that promises were fragile things, easily broken. She did not want to build hope only for it to crumble, but Daniel did not disappear. True to his word, he returned, not with arrogance, not with extravagance, but with quiet persistence. He would stop by the bookstore where she worked, not to flaunt his wealth, but to sit with her during her break and talk. He asked her about her dreams, about the things she had once imagined for herself before life had narrowed her choices. At first, she found it difficult to speak of such things. Dreams felt dangerous when reality had been so cruel. But Daniel listened with patience, and slowly her words began to spill out. She told him about her love for writing, about the notebook she carried where she filled pages with thoughts, stories, and hopes she had never shared with anyone. She told him about her desire to study, to build a life where she could help others instead of just surviving. Daniel listened intently, never interrupting, never dismissing. And then, in his calm but determined way, he began to open doors. He connected her with programs that could support her education. He helped her find resources that provided not just financial aid, but mentors who believed in her potential. He made sure she had food in her kitchen, clothes that fit, and a roof that did not leak, but he did it carefully, always respecting her dignity. He never made her feel like a charity case. Instead, he made her feel like a partner in her own transformation. At first, Amara resisted. She had lived so long in scarcity that abundance felt foreign, even frightening. She questioned his motives, wondered why he cared so deeply. But every time doubt rose, Daniel's actions proved him true. He never asked for anything in return. He never spoke down to her. He only reminded her of what she had already proven, that even in her lowest moments, she had chosen kindness, and that choice had made her extraordinary. Weeks turned into months, and Amara's life began to shift in ways she could hardly comprehend. She enrolled in classes, clutching her books with trembling hands the first day she walked into a classroom filled with younger students. She felt out of place, uncertain if she belonged, but Daniel encouraged her, reminding her that knowledge belonged to anyone willing to seek it. At night, she studied by the glow of her lamp, her notebook filling with new ideas, new stories, new visions of what her future could hold. The changes were not only material. For the first time in years, Amara felt herself standing taller. Neighbors began to notice her differently, no longer just the quiet girl with tired eyes, but a woman with purpose. The old couple she had once fed visited her often, their frail smiles brightening her home. They told her she had given them not just food that night, but dignity, and now they saw her blooming into the woman she was always meant to be. Their gratitude became a constant reminder that her life had meaning far beyond what she had once believed. Through it all, Daniel remained at her side, not as a savior, but as a witness and a supporter. He saw her struggles and celebrated her victories no matter how small. He often told her that the true wealth of life was not in possessions, but in the lives we touch. And each time he said it, Amara felt the truth of it more deeply. One evening, months after that fateful night at the diner, Amara sat once again at her small table, though now it no longer felt so empty. The walls of her apartment were brighter, not because they had been repainted, but because her spirit had filled the space with warmth. On the table lay her open notebook, its pages brimming with words. Daniel sat across from her, sipping tea, his eyes calm as always. She looked at him, her voice trembling with sincerity. "You changed my life," she whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "No, Amara, you changed your life. All I did was step into the story you had already begun to write. You were always strong. You were always kind. I only helped you see it." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not from despair. They were from gratitude, from hope, from the realization that her sacrifices had not been in vain. She had given when she had nothing, and in return, she had received not just help, but a chance to live fully. As the evening light faded, Amara thought back to the moment in the diner when she had pushed her meal toward the old couple. It had seemed so small then, a fleeting act in a world too large to notice, but that single choice had become the turning point of her life. It had brought strangers to her door, had awakened a billionaire's forgotten humanity, and had reminded her that kindness, even in its smallest form, could transform lives. Her journey was far from over. There would still be struggles, still be days of doubt and difficulty, but she no longer faced them alone. She carried within her the knowledge that her actions mattered, that her voice mattered, that her life mattered. And that knowledge gave her strength enough to face whatever came next. Amara closed her notebook, her hands steady, her heart full. She looked at Daniel and smiled softly. "Kindness never leaves empty hands," she said. Daniel returned the smile, his voice firm. "And yours will never be empty again." In that moment, in that small apartment that once carried only silence and struggle, Amara felt her life transformed. Not by wealth alone, not by promises or grand gestures, but by the simple truth that one act of compassion could open a door to a future she had never dared to imagine. And as the night deepened, Amara knew with certainty that her story, once written in hunger and sacrifice, had now been rewritten in hope and possibility.